Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you on such a cold afternoon. Our session 26 this afternoon is all about King Darius, the Second Temple, and Ezra. The first Jews to return from their exile in Babylon had set off in the year 536, only to arrive and find Jerusalem still in ruins. Do you remember? The odd building, half-ruined walls, just desolation. They found it in ruins, but now occupied by newcomers who'd rebuilt many of the ruined houses which had formerly been their homes. It was not a happy homecoming for the travellers. The new residents just wanted them to go away again and gave them no help at all with their ambition to rebuild the ruined temple. And the travellers were soon very demoralised. They struggled to stay alive, but they did manage to find the site of the temple and clear it. But sadly, they had no money left to rebuild it. They did what they could, however, and erected an altar on the cleared platform. So sacrificial worship gradually began to be a daily exercise for the priests once more. And that was all they achieved for 16 years. They kept themselves to themselves and referred to themselves as the people of Judah, in contrast to the others, whom they called the people of the land. In contrast to the others, however, in the course of time, a few young priestly men managed to get a foothold into their old hereditary homes by marrying the daughters of those families. It seems there was a shortage of young ladies who'd come from Babylon, so intermarriage began to happen quite naturally. And more of the consequences of that later on. But in the year 520, let me remind you, a Persian soldier, Darius, had seized the throne of Persia after a time of political chaos and become the most famous of all the Persian kings, with a huge new empire to be organized as soon as possible. Darius the Great. He deserved his honorable title. He was a very successful soldier, but more importantly, he proved to be a very competent builder and administrator, enabling the whole of his new empire to be ruled by one man only, himself and, of course, his heirs in their turn. They lived far away from Jerusalem in Susa and Ecbatana, both of them now in modern-day Iran, where Darius had built a beautiful palace at nearby Persepolis. His empire was organized into provinces called satrapies. A vast empire, all under satrapies, under the control of satraps, the Persian word for our governor. The satrap ruled on behalf of the king, but his spies were everywhere and kept him in touch with what the satraps were doing, so there was no trouble. Remember, everything in this story now is new, very different from everything we learned in parts 1 and 2. And I'm sorry, we've just got to cope with it. It is a complete difference. Jerusalem was no longer the capital of a small kingdom. It was merely a small city in the satrapy of beyond Euphrates, or beyond the river, where the satrap ruled from Damascus. And that was the enemy territory, you remember, from long ago. Communications were speedy, were possible, as never before, with good roads and bridges all leading to Persia, with efficient staging posts every 15 miles. Life was going to be very different indeed for the lives of Jews in Jerusalem for the next 200 years. So we reach a period of stability, or sort of. Darius was very concerned to ensure that all the peoples in his vast empire were at peace with him and also with themselves. He encouraged them all to live according to their own customs and worship their own gods, even though he wanted his religion of the prophet Zoroaster, with its two gods of light and darkness, to be the binding faith for this new empire. Egypt and North Africa were Darius's first concern. They were the most recent conquests and furthest away from Persia. Therefore, the Mediterranean coastline was in constant use by his soldiers and diplomatic officials, who soon brought him reports of the sorry state of Jerusalem, so close to their route. Darius, the man of action, turned his attention to Jerusalem. And he worked wonders, absolute wonders for the Jews in only 4 years. The records of this time are rather muddled, but we find some of them in the books of Ezra-Nehemiah. But we can begin with Ezra chapter 6, and I quote, "King Darius made a decree, and he searched the archives where the documents were stored in Babylon. But it was in Ecbatana, the capital in the province of Media, that a scroll was found on which it was written, a record. In the first year of his reign, King Cyrus issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt, the place where sacrifices are offered. Let the cost be paid from the royal treasury. Moreover, let the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, be restored and brought back to the temple in Jerusalem." And this decree of Darius continues. "Now you, Tattenai, satrap of the province beyond the river, keep away. Let the work on this house of God alone. Let the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site. Moreover, I make a decree regarding what you shall do for the rebuilding. The cost is to be paid by these people in full, and without delay from the royal revenue, the tribute of the province beyond the river." Well, Darius accepted the binding legitimacy of this decree and implemented it. He also ordered lots of food, wheat, salt, wine, or oil to be given to the Jews every day, as well as animals for sacrifices to their God, requesting that they pray for the life of the king and his children. And Tattenai the satrap obeyed. It seems that Darius also authorized the second group of Jews in Babylon to journey to Jerusalem, this time under the leadership of a prince Zerubbabel, another Davidic prince, together with the priest Joshua. And many more Jews returned to Jerusalem, this time with lots of enthusiasm and with royal authorization to travel in safety. The Jews rejoiced, and urged on by their prophets Haggai and Zechariah, the rebuilding started. Haggai's prophecy was short and to the point. Build the house of God, and prosperity will return to the fields. He did add a new element to their thinking, though. Questions of holiness were asked. How should the people behave? But whereas in former times the prophets urged people to high standards of moral behavior, Haggai was different. He urged the people to live pure lives, meaning avoiding uncleanness in their ritual behaviour. A big difference there. Purity became the new requirement for the future. Remember that in exile, the priestly school had written the Code of Holiness, which is now embedded into the book of Leviticus. Haggai even expressed his own hope that trouble might erupt in Persia and Zerubbabel would become their new political leader. Now, this was dangerous thinking, and it's uncertain whether this was the pious hope of the prophet or a popular hope among the people. But no more mention is to be found of Zerubbabel. You draw your own conclusions. Zechariah, the first 8 chapters, is written in the apocalyptic style of visions of the heavenly realms, full of angels and demons. But his message was the same: rebuild the temple and all will be well. Human nature, though, always has to be taken into account. And there was some opposition, first from the people of the land. Originally, they'd wanted the Jews to go away. But now, in the changing times, they wanted to join in and offered to help with the rebuilding. But then came a huge shock. Their offers were totally rejected. Adding insult to injury, they were told that the work had to be done by proper Jews. And then, as they watched what was going on, the rejected ones began to fear that there would soon be a complete takeover by the ebullient priests, and it would be themselves who would be forced to leave Jerusalem. Hints of their fears possibly alerted the satrap's attention in Samaria. Tattenai, the satrap, investigated and wanted to know the names of all the builders so that he could let Darius know. He did make a report in very respectful and diplomatic letter, which is recorded in the 5th chapter of the book of Ezra. But Darius reminded him that he himself had given the Jews permission to rebuild the temple, and it all went ahead. And the building was finished in the 4th year of the reign of Darius. Well, it was dedicated with much pomp and solemnity in the year 516 BCE. With the dedication came the Passover festival, re-established in Jerusalem and led by the priests and Levites, who were all ritually purified before the killing of the sacrificial lambs. We're told that those who celebrated the Passover included all who had joined them. Well, they're getting in. All who had joined them, meaning, of course, only those families in Jerusalem to whom they were now related by marriage. The new second temple building was in reality a mere shadow of what Solomon's original Phoenician-style temple had been. But it served the people of Jerusalem well for centuries, until it was rebuilt on a much grander scale in the lifetime of Jesus by King Herod. So here is a picture of what we think the second temple looked like. Very simple, just the main building, the altar outside, and a few steps. Very simple. Not taking up much space, but built on the site of where the old centre of the old temple had been. Now, we're more used to seeing pictures of Herod's temple, which was vastly bigger and only built while Jesus was alive and growing up. But the temple of Herod, here's a picture. Look at what the second temple was like, just that simple building, and now look at the vast area occupied by Herod's temple. To build that, of course, he had to build up the mountain. The temple had been built on a slope of the top of the mountain, but now he had to build up the sides of the mountain to create that huge platform on which all those beautiful Grecian-style arcades went all the way round. And it was a vast place, the largest temple in the ancient world. Well, that was Herod's temple, but we've got a long way to go before we get there. So the second temple is up and running. But without any political leadership, because neither Sheshbazzar or Zerubbabel are ever mentioned again, Jerusalem began to grow into what we can only call a religious community. Leadership was firmly in the hands of the priests and, to a lesser degree, the Levites, those teachers who worked alongside the priests. And as time went by, the priests began to prosper and grow rich from the temple dues and offerings. And soon there were even more marriages between the old families and the new in Jerusalem. New families were rather glad. The incoming priests were getting quite wealthy, and it was something worth having. The senior priest assumed the prestigious title of high priest, a title that became hereditary, while the concept of the holy city, that is, the city that is perfect, was idolized amongst the Jews still living far away in Babylon and Egypt, or anywhere else. And Jerusalem began to be a pilgrim city for Jews who could and would travel there occasionally. And there were 3 great pilgrim feasts each year: Passover, and eventually Pentecost and Sukkoth. That's the festival of the booths at the grape harvest. The pilgrims would witness the daily rituals of the priests who observed the purity rites and wore robes that became more and more glorious as time went on. There they are. The high priest is on the right, with robes much more glorious than the ordinary priest. And can you see the breastplate he's wearing? That became very, very famous in the years to come. We'll hear more about the high priest's breastplate later. But his robes really did develop into something rather grand. The pilgrims would hear the trumpets and the musicians and all the music. Some trumpeters. Just imagine the amount of noise they could make. There were more than 2 of them too. The Old Testament book of Psalms is often called the hymn book of the Second Temple. And if you look at the superscriptions when you've got your Psalms in front of you, read what it says above the first verse, the superscription, and you'll find many of them reflecting the different choirs and even naming the different choir masters involved in the temple worship. And Psalm 84 is a classic example. It begins, "How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. My soul longs, indeed faints, for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh sing for joy to the living God. Happy are those who live in your house, ever singing your praise." Just imagine the wish of the people who only came occasionally, just thinking how wonderful it must be to live there, without realizing, of course, that people were human who did live there. Well, all this compares with other pilgrimages in other religions and in different times. For example, Christian pilgrims to St. Peter's in the Vatican, or we have English pilgrims to Walsingham in Norfolk. And of course the Muslims have their annual pilgrimage to Mecca. But we, however, must remember that in reality, Jerusalem, like Rome, like Walsingham, Mecca, was populated with ordinary people who were not holy all the time. Well, the priestly, we seem to have jumped. Let's go back. Don't want that. Oh no. All right. The priestly Old Testament history books had probably been started in Babylon, but they were continued as time went by in Jerusalem. So there are 4 books in this collection. The first is 1 Chronicles, starting with the story of King David. They were very proud of him. But of course they only related the good stories about him, so nothing from that chronicle gets a mention. It does end with one of the finest prayers in the Old Testament, put into the mouth of David himself. I expect you'll recognize it. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness, the power, the glory, the victory, and the majesty. For all that is in the heavens and on the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord, and you are exalted as head above all. And this, of course, firmly puts a halo around David's head for all Jews forevermore. The second book of Chronicles is all about King Solomon, who carried out David's instructions and built the first temple. They were the books that probably came back from Babylon. So it was the priests in Jerusalem who carried on with the 3rd and the 4th books. They didn't do quite as well. The 2nd and the 3rd and the 4th books are Ezra and Nehemiah. Well, they got in a big muddle with those, as we'll find out. Back now, though, to our story, set among the bricks and the mortars of reality in the earthly city of Jerusalem, with its very human population. We can get hints from some of the later prophets of what life might have been like. The first of these is 3rd Isaiah, or Trito Isaiah, whose writings were added to the already long scroll of the original, chapters 56 to 66. And in these chapters, he welcomed the foreigners who'd separated themselves and wholeheartedly joined the community of Yahweh. So there was some sort of fluid movement. But then, a chapter later, he found it necessary to condemn those who still favoured the old Canaanite fertility gods, and Moloch in particular, who was connected to the sacrifices of children. In chapter 58, he criticises people for the wrong use of fasting. Fasting, yes, very showy, while still oppressing all their workers and making life difficult for them and picking fights. But then we get to chapter 60 and 61, and he speaks to remind them of the lofty ideas of his predecessor, that 2nd Isaiah of Babylon. Well, we have some more little prophets, minor prophets. The prophet Obadiah and the prophet Joel reflect this time in Jewish history. Joel describes a plague of locusts. Well, really? Or was he really talking about a plague of a rampaging section of the Persian army passing by? Well, you guess. But he describes this as a sign of God's coming day of judgment and urges people to use the New Year festival in the autumn, Rosh Hashanah, as a time of repentance. All these new ideas are flowing in, aren't they? And of course, years later, this culminated on the 10th day, Yom Kippur, with the Day of Atonement, as it still is today. But then Joel says, Yahweh's Spirit will be poured out upon them. All this, of course, reflecting a combination of pre-exilic teaching and apocalyptic visions of cosmic upheavals, all rather a muddle if you try to read it. Then we have the prophet Malachi. He condemned the people whose worship had become habitual rather than wholehearted, bringing inferior animals for sacrifices, and then complaining they didn't seem to receive any benefits from God. Malachi suggested that people should pay proper tithes and be fearful of being measured before a day of judgment. Forget that word tithes, please. It got written back into that prophecy. And then we meet in the time of Jesus and all these new developments in Jewish practices we find in the time of Jesus were greatly influenced by the Persian religion of the two gods, light and darkness. And we just gloss over those terms in the New Testament. We think all the time, let your light shine. Yes, well, not that light, God's light. It's all been adapted but used because it's popular thinking, and you use popular thinking but give it a different meaning. And we find a number of times light and darkness are mentioned in the New Testament, and it's all come from Persia originally. Well, now, I'm afraid, we reach a 50-year gap in our story. And I refer you to Chronicle chart number 3. Now, you took this home with you last time, and if you didn't, there are more copies on the table, and you certainly can't read it from the screen. But that's what it looks like, and it does enable you to realize how difficult it is to be confidently correct in the order of the events that followed in the Jewish story. Now, this history gap of 50 years comes in between chapter 6 and 7 in the book of Ezra. So if you write in your Bibles, just get in there just 50 years before the next one. Chapter 7 begins in the reign of King Artaxerxes of Persia. Ezra went up to Babylon. Now, King Artaxerxes, you can't see on that chart on the screen, I'm sure, but, and there is a but. Look at the chart. You'll find correctly from the Persian records, there was King Artaxerxes the first, but also the second, and also the third. Then ask, when did Ezra arrive in Babylon? In the reign of King Artaxerxes. But we're never told which one. So you have to make up your mind and guess. The first lived in 465. See, we're galloping on over the years, getting nearer and nearer to the New Testament. The first in the 460s. The second one on the turn of the 400s to the 300s. And the third one, well, getting on towards the 200s. So time is passing. Which Artaxerxes was it? Well, when the priestly history writers came to record the next events, they didn't know either. And there are several possible answers. We start with the dating for Nehemiah, strangely enough, 445. That is okay. And that's in the reign of the third Artaxerxes, and corroborated in the Elephantine papyri of Egypt. And in that it mentions the sons of Sanballat. We'll come to that next in a fortnight's time. So then ask, did Ezra come to Jerusalem before or at the same time as Nehemiah or after? Some scholars even question, did Ezra really exist? Or was he a construct of the priests for the purposes of being a reforming priest par excellence? They certainly tried to say that both Ezra and Nehemiah were contemporaries, but that didn't work in spite of their efforts. So the answer is we don't know, and you're free to choose your own option. My option is that there probably was a real Ezra, but his work proves such an unpopular challenge that it was quickly out of favour and soon forgotten. Because in two other references in the apocryphal histories, Nehemiah is mentioned twice, but Ezra not at all. The stories we have of both are now hopelessly intertwined in the Old Testament as Ezra followed by Nehemiah. But I shall follow that possibility. So we come to the story of Ezra. And King Artaxerxes the First. These are carvings from ancient Iran. Well, the story of Ezra, the priestly scribe from Babylon, seems to fit during the reign of Artaxerxes I in 428, just 50 to 60 years after the Second Temple had come into being. He was authorized to take a book of Jewish law from the priests in Babylon and take it and establish it among the Jews in Jerusalem. The king's mandate is recorded in Ezra chapter 7, and it begins, "This is a copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave to the priest Ezra, the scribe, a scholar of the text of the commandments of Yahweh and his statutes for Israel. Artaxerxes, king of kings, to the priest Ezra, the scribe of the law of the God of heaven, peace to you. And now I decree that any of the people of Israel or their priests and Levites in my kingdom who freely offers to go to Jerusalem may go with you. For you are sent by the king and his 7 counselors to make inquiries about Judah and Jerusalem according to the law of your God, which is in your hand, and also to convey the silver and gold that the king and all his counselors have freely offered to the God of Israel." Such was the sophistication and the goodness of Persian rule. Who could grumble? Well, only the people who objected, of course. But the decree continues. "I, Artaxerxes, decree that to all the treasurers in the province beyond the river, whatever the priest Ezra requires of you, let it be done with all diligence." Well, this wasn't carte blanche, of course. There's a long list detailing what Ezra could legitimately ask for. But it did ensure that these gifts were not to be taxed in any way. Ezra was also commissioned to appoint magistrates and judges to oversee the people of Judea and punish anyone who refused to obey God's law, either with death or banishment, or confiscation of their property, or imprisonment. So this wasn't just a happy-go-lucky event, it was a royal decree to be carried out. Well, armed with such a mandate, Ezra collected together all the Jews who would go with him and join the community in the holy and perfect city, asking many of them to help transport all the gifts they'd been given. They prayed for a safe journey, and all went well. They had royal approval for their journey, and the king, no doubt, eager to have law and order working efficiently in Jerusalem. They eventually arrived without mishap, and after resting for 3 days, all the silver, gold, and other treasures were weighed out, counted, recorded, and handed over to the temple priests and Levites. And then the celebrations began. The whole community gathered at the temple, where many animals were offered as a thanksgiving sacrifice to God. And with that, we come to the end of chapter 8, which reads, "The next day, Ezra began his work, only to hear that," and I quote, "the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the people of the land with all their abominations, for they have taken some of their daughters as wives for their sons. And thus the holy seed has mixed itself with the peoples of the land. And in this faithfulness, the officials and leaders have led the way." Ezra was appalled. He tore his clothes, pulled hair from his beard and his head, and was speechless for quite a while. In the evening he prayed, "Oh my God, I am too ashamed and embarrassed to lift my face to you." Shall we break your commandments again and intermarry with the peoples that practice the abominations? And during the next month, Ezra selected a few men from the leading families to examine and make a list of all who had married foreign women. Chapter 10 lists them all by name. And Ezra took action. He made them all swear to divorce their wives and send them away, all these foreign wives, and all the children. Their names are all recorded from verses 18 to 44. You think, 18 to 44, the names of all those who were sent away. But we don't have a record of their reaction to this edict, which was enforced upon them. And at that point, the book of Ezra ends. And what happened next is the story that is embedded into chapter 8 and 9 of Nehemiah. So you must jump there. An assembly was summoned in Jerusalem, and all the people of Jerusalem who could hear with understanding gathered in the square in front of the water gate. And Ezra brought the book of the law he brought from Babylon. And for the next 7 days, he read aloud portions of it every morning, standing on a high platform that had been erected for the purpose. People all around, and Ezra reading the book he had brought from Babylon, which of course was unknown to the people of Jerusalem. For 7 days he read from it every morning. And then after the prayers of thanksgiving, a group of the Levites, the teachers, helped the people to understand what it all meant. So they read from the book, from the law of God, with interpretation. They gave the sense, so that people understood the reading. And they next studied the law, which commanded them and taught them how to keep the festival of booths, that festival of Sukkot. Every autumn, they had to keep it for 7 days while camping out in the temporary structures to be constructed for the purpose. And of course, the Jews still do that. Every Jew either lives in the conservatory or builds a hut in the garden or finds some sort of temporary accommodation for 7 days for the festival of booths, remembering how they camped out with the great harvest. So the festival of booths took place for 7 days, and on each day of that festival, Ezra read again from the book of the law. And it finished on the 8th day with what we're told was a solemn assembly. So what was this book? The honest answer is we do not know for sure. It was obviously compiled in Babylon and imposed upon the people of Jerusalem who didn't know what it said. It used to be thought years ago, and certainly when I was younger, that this book was the whole of the Pentateuch, but it couldn't have been. It wasn't completed by this time, we now know. But maybe it was part of the Pentateuch, possibly even that code of holiness, now incorporated in Leviticus. Because we think that because of its emphasis on purity and ritual, cleanliness, and its instructions about the festival of booths. Other people think it might have been the priestly code, now completed in Babylon, with its editing of the J and E codes, as in Genesis and Exodus. But whatever it was, it had a great and lasting impact on the ritual and cleanliness rules imposed by the priests, but with one exception. The divorce law was very unpopular, and very soon after the time of Ezra, it was quietly forgotten. Next time, we shall look at the story and experience of Nehemiah, maybe even a century after Ezra. Certainly in the reign of one of the King Artaxerxes of Persia, maybe the second or the third. Well, then we should have that in 2 weeks' time on Sunday, the 19th of March, 4:30. Hope to see you then. And in the meantime, keep warm and survive. Thank you for coming. Hope you enjoyed it. With Nehemiah, of course, we reach the stage where we have no more characters of the Old Testament with stories to tell. The story goes on, but we have to look at other things that were going on instead of characters. But we should keep on steadily until we get right the way through. And it have to go to history books, of course, from all over to fill in what was going on, because Jerusalem was such a minor little place in the empire. Yeah. It almost didn't get noticed. Anyway, that's for the future. Thank you for coming.
That book you pointed us to early on is very useful. I can't remember what it's called. I'd go back and read that. You know, I've got it second hand. Yeah. He recommended a book when we first started this.
Sorry.
I've got them as well.
Yes, I've got my ear.